Entitled man grabbed the waitress. The mafia boss saw everything and whispered one word. The wineglass hit the ground faster than eyes blinked. The table was already loud before Naira approached. Crystal glasses clinked with arrogance, and half-chewed steak filled the space between bragging and laughter. Declan Rothschild sat at the center like he was hosting a private auction, leaning back with his jacket off and his privilege on full display. Naira placed their second round on the table without a word. "Still no smile?" Declan asked, cocking his head toward her like she was a mute prop that needed fixing. His friends chuckled, the kind of laugh that didn't come from humor but from habit. Naira didn't answer. She didn't even blink. She set down the final drink, adjusted the tray under her arm, and stepped back one pace. Declan looked her over again, slowly, like he was measuring his power in inches, and she was standing in the wrong spot. "You always this serious?" he said, leaning forward. "Come on, a little smile doesn't cost much." Still, Naira said nothing. Her silence wasn't shyness. It was strategy. He didn't know that. He leaned in further. "I mean, we're paying top dollar to be here. At least give us some warmth with the service." His tone stayed light, but the edge underneath it was sharp. Naira glanced down once to confirm the glasses were all stable on the table, then straightened. "I'm not here to entertain you," she said, voice steady. "Only to serve you." That earned a low whistle from the guy seated across Declan. Some hedge fund heir with too much tan for Chicago in November. "She's got fire," he muttered. Declan's smile faded, and that's when he reached out. Fingers closed around her wrist. Not tight, not aggressive at first, but enough to pause her step, enough to say, "I can." Naira looked down, then back at him. "Please don't touch me," he smirked. "Don't be dramatic, it's just appreciation." His thumb moved across her wrist like he owned the moment. Her pulse didn't jump, but her eyes, they turned cold. She didn't pull away, not yet. Declan kept his grip, loose, but claiming. His friends glanced between them, the laughter dimming under the weight of discomfort none of them dared name. Naira's voice stayed even. "This is your last warning. Let go." He leaned back a little, still holding her wrist. "Or what? You'll throw me out?" The arrogance in his smile could have filled the whole restaurant. To him, she was just a server, an invisible girl delivering expensive liquor to richer men. What he didn't notice was how the air behind him shifted. It wasn't sound. It wasn't movement. It was absence. From across the restaurant, near the hallway that led to the wine cellar, the corner booth sat quieter than usual. The seat was still occupied. The man inside still hadn't ordered anything, still hadn't taken off his coat, but his eyes, they were no longer on his menu. They were on Declan. Julio Cesar had been watching for a while. He never interrupted the dance of foolish men too early. That would spoil the reveal. He watched Declan's fingers press firmer against skin that didn't invite it. He watched the way Naira didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't plead for attention or rescue. She stood straight, like someone whose balance couldn't be taken, only measured. Julio murmured a name. His bodyguard, seated just behind the booth, stood before anyone noticed. The man moved with calm steps toward the main floor, never touching his jacket, never raising a voice. Meanwhile, at the table, Declan gave her wrist a small squeeze, like a punctuation mark on a statement no one else heard. "You act like this job makes you powerful," he whispered. "But you're just here to carry plates, sweetheart." Naira's tray dipped slightly, only slightly, and that was enough. Declan noticed it too late. She smiled, barely, not for him, but because she'd just seen what he hadn't. The shift in the room was small, but undeniable. The hostess at the front glanced up, then quickly looked away. A bartender paused mid-pour. A violinist in the corner sectioned off his next note with a longer breath than usual. Declan noticed none of it. He was too focused on control, on keeping his fingers where they didn't belong, convinced that nothing and no one could touch him here. Until a shadow fell over the table. A new presence, a different weight. Declan's hand was no longer on Naira. It was in someone else's grip. The bodyguard didn't speak, didn't glare, He simply held Declan's wrist like he was examining a watch he didn't remember buying. Declan looked up, confused. What the hell? The man's stare shut him up. His eyes weren't angry, just unreadable. With a calm twist, he peeled Declan's fingers off Naira's skin one by one. Deliberate, methodical. Each second stretched like it had more meaning than Declan could process. The entire table fell quiet. Even the senator's son held his breath for a moment. Naira didn't move. She didn't rub her wrist. She didn't retreat. She stepped back once and lowered the tray. "Hey, I didn't mean anything," Declan said, suddenly finding a voice too late. "It's just, look, I was joking, all right? A misunderstanding." The grip didn't tighten. It didn't loosen either. The bodyguard leaned closer. He said one word, too low for anyone else to hear. Declan's smirk cracked. His posture stiffened. His Adam's apple jumped. "Wait, hold on," he muttered, voice breaking for the first time all night. The bodyguard glanced across the room. Naira followed his eyes. Julio Cesar stood now. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't raised a finger, but somehow the very space between the tables seemed to widen around him, like gravity had changed direction. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets, ignoring the ripple of discomfort his movement caused. Patrons looked away. Waitstaff found new corners to clean. He passed the wine cart, the bread table, a cluster of lawyers pretending not to notice anything. And then he reached Declan's table. He looked down at Declan, then to Naira, then back to Declan again. Declan's mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. "Sir, I didn't realize I wasn't trying to disrespect." Julio Cesar didn't blink. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't explain. He turned his head slightly, just enough for his words to land exactly where they needed to. "Leave." The single word cut through more than any raised voice ever could. The table froze. Declan looked around for backup, for permission, for something to grab onto. His friends didn't move, didn't speak. One of them suddenly remembered his water glass and stared into it like it held an escape plan. The bodyguard released Declan's arm. Declan stumbled slightly as he stood, brushing down his shirt like dusting off shame. Julio didn't step aside. He just waited. Declan backed away without a word, his face drained of all color, swagger stripped clean in front of everyone. He walked out of Bella Vita with no coat, no dignity, and no applause. The violins never stopped playing. They simply lowered as if bowing to what had happened, then resumed like this was part of the show. Julio turned to Naira. "You're good," he said. 3 words, even, dry. Then he returned to his booth, untouched. The bodyguard followed. Naira stood still for a moment, pulse steady but alert. She looked down at the untouched bourbon on the table, picked up her tray and walked back toward the kitchen. In the kitchen, the head chef peeked out the swinging door. What happened? She set the tray down. Someone learned a lesson. Then she unpinned her name tag, dropped it on the prep counter, and stepped outside the staff door. Cool air met her face. The alley was empty. There was no sound of traffic, no lingering cigarette smoke from the dish crew, no buzz of old neon from the corner bodega. Just the slow, calculated hum of silence that followed her from inside. She paused near the dumpster and adjusted the strap of her bag. Then she looked up. Across the street, beneath the only working street lamp, a man leaned against a black car. The bodyguard. He wasn't staring. He wasn't motionless either. He was waiting, like he already knew where she'd exit and when. She didn't flinch. She crossed. When she stopped a few feet in front of him, he looked at her for the first time. No threat in his face, no emotion either. He nodded once, then handed her something. An envelope. No markings, no seal. Thick. He didn't speak. And Naira didn't ask. She accepted it. Then he reached behind him and opened the car door. Not for her to get in, for someone else to get out. But no one did, because the back seat was empty. The gesture wasn't about a ride. It was about a message. You're not dismissed. You're remembered. He shut the door again, gave her one more nod, then walked around the car and got in the front passenger seat. The vehicle pulled away without a sound. Naira stood alone on the sidewalk. She waited until the taillights disappeared down the hill before she opened the envelope. Inside, one folded sheet of paper. Thick, stock, handwritten. One line, "Some people earn protection. You did more than that." She refolded it, walked home with steady feet. At her door, she looked over her shoulder once, not out of fear, but awareness. The kind of awareness that came after power had shifted and you weren't sure yet who noticed. She stepped inside her apartment and locked the door behind her. For the first time in months, the air inside felt still, too still, until her phone buzzed. The screen lit up. Unknown number. She let it buzz once more before answering. No greeting, no hesitation. She said nothing. The voice on the other end didn't ask for permission to speak. "You won't be approached again," he said. It was the same voice from Bella Vita, the same man who said one word and emptied a room of noise. Julio Cesar. His voice was lower now. Not soft, just final. "I didn't ask for anything," Naira replied, her tone flat, controlled. "I know," he said. "That's why I stepped in." Silence hung between them. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to respond, or if he even cared. "You have the letter?" he asked. "I read it, and I'm not anyone's property. You weren't treated like property. You were respected. I didn't need help. You didn't ask for it. That's the difference." Another pause. It was her turn now. "What do you want?" There was a long breath on the other side. Then, nothing yet. The line went dead. She stared at the phone, then placed it face down on the counter. Her fridge hummed. The street outside stayed quiet. She moved to the window, drew the curtain back just a few inches, and looked. Out. She exhaled and let go of the curtain. Across the room, the envelope still sat on her table. She walked over, opened it again, and this time noticed something tucked in the crease. A single name, and an address. She read it twice. It wasn't familiar, but she wrote it down anyway. Naira stepped out into the morning like it was any other. But it wasn't. The air felt tighter somehow, like the streets had heard something overnight they weren't ready to repeat. She walked her usual route, coat zipped halfway, hands in her pockets, eyes alert but relaxed. Same shoes, same steps, same cracked sidewalk outside Manny's corner store. But people looked at her differently now. The guy who usually swept the front of the barber shop didn't nod this time. He looked at her, paused mid-sweep, and then pretended to focus on the pavement. A woman with 2 kids crossing the street stared a second too long before hurrying them along. She turned the corner, past the laundromat, and stepped into her regular coffee shop. The cashier, who never got her name right, didn't speak. He simply handed her the cup without asking, the lid already sealed. She hadn't paid yet. "I got it," he muttered, eyes not meeting hers. Naira said nothing. She took the coffee and walked back out. The street felt different, like the world had taken a step back, unsure whether to clap or hide. She turned down the alley behind her building, same as always. Quiet, familiar, safe. But today, someone was already there. A man stood near the dumpster, leaned against the graffiti-scarred brick wall. He didn't belong here. Too clean, too still. He didn't block her path. He didn't smile either. "You made someone nervous," he said. Naira stopped 2 steps away. "And you are?" "Someone who knows how this works." She didn't blink. "And how does it work?" He tilted his head slightly. "You're protected now. That makes you visible. I've always been visible." He shook his head. "No. You've always been quiet. Now you're watched." She raised an eyebrow. "You're trying to scare me?" He chuckled once. Dry. "No. Just letting you know. You're valuable now." She started to walk past him. That's when he added, "And valuable things get traded." She stopped, turned back, but he was already gone. She stood there for another second, staring at the spot where he'd been. No footsteps. Naira looked up toward her apartment window. Nothing had moved. Still curtains. Still the same. Chipped frame. But everything felt altered, like the space she'd lived in had shifted 1 inch to the left while she slept. She turned and walked up the stairs without a word. Inside, the air was still warm from the radiator that never turned off. She dropped her bag, locked both bolts, and opened the envelope from Bellavita that she had tucked into the side of her purse the night before. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order. The next morning, when Naira arrived at Bellavita, the hostess handed her a different apron, one with a silver-stitched name tag she hadn't asked for, a new title, a new section, and a note beneath the fold. Some promotions aren't earned by tenure. They're earned by standing still when most would run. She had been moved to the front section of the dining room, reserved for regulars, high spenders, and those with more influence than manners. That section was never given to someone with less than 5 years. She had barely been there for one. The corner table, reserved for Julio Cesar, was empty, but the air around it was full. 2 customers in her new section looked up as she passed. One nodded before she even introduced herself. The other whispered something to his dining partner, then quickly quieted when she neared. She checked her first table's settings, adjusted the knife that sat half a centimeter out of line, and turned just in time to see the kitchen door swing open. The floor manager was walking toward her. He paused, cleared his throat. "Ms. Ellis," he said, the first time he'd ever used her last name, or any name at all. "You've got a visitor in the alley," he said, voice low. She didn't ask who sent them, didn't ask how they knew where she'd be. She simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward the kitchen like it was routine. She pushed through the metal door and stepped out into the alley. Same cracked wall, same trash bins, same damp concrete. But this time, it wasn't a stranger waiting. It was a woman, mid-30s, long braid, jacket too sharp for the neighborhood. She looked up, chin tilted. "You don't know me," the woman said, "but I know who's watching you." Naira stayed still. "Is this a threat?" The woman shook her head. "It's a forecast." Naira narrowed her eyes. "Speak clearly. I don't have time for riddles." The woman folded her arms. "Cesar stepped in for you. That makes you his asset, which means you're now in play." "I didn't ask for protection," Naira said. The woman smirked. "Doesn't matter. That's not how it works." She leaned off the wall, walking 2 slow steps forward. "You think men like him protect people out of kindness? No, they make moves. And once you're in the circle of a man like Julio Cesar, you're no longer invisible. You're marked." Naira didn't flinch. "And you're here because—" The woman gave a slight nod, not of respect, but acknowledgement. "There are others who see value in you now, not because of who you are, but because of what your association signals, which is that Cesar's watching you, and if he's watching you, then everyone else should be too." Naira looked at the alley exit, then back at her. "Say what you came to say." The woman stepped closer. "You're standing in the middle of a line. One side is Julio Cesar. The other? People who've waited years to hurt him." Naira didn't respond, not immediately. "Then, and you think I'm going to let myself be used? I think you already have been." The silence stretched. "You're valuable now," the woman said again, "and valuable things get traded." Then she turned and walked away without waiting for permission. Naira didn't follow. She stood there, coat sleeve fluttering slightly as the wind picked up in the alley. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. 1 missed call. No number, no voicemail. Just silence. Back inside Bellavita, a folded note sat tucked inside her menu booklet. In block letters it read, "They approached you. That means you're in. Be ready." They called him many names, but never twice in the same room. Julio Cesar didn't just hold power in South Chicago. He shaped it. Quietly, permanently, and always behind doors that stayed locked even after they were opened. Most of the waitstaff at Bellavita never spoke to him directly. They didn't need to. His presence alone shaped behavior. Every Tuesday he took the same booth. Farthest corner, half shadowed by the wine cellar hallway. No reservation, no escort. Just him, his silence, and a man posted 2 steps behind. The line cooks whispered stories about him in between orders. One swore Caesar once tipped a server $5,000 for not interrupting his meeting with a wine suggestion. Another claimed Julio once made a senator cry in the alley. No raised voice, no audience, just words exchanged under yellow light. None of the stories were confirmed, but all of them were believed. In Bella Vita, he was treated with a different kind of respect, not the fake smiles and polished manners reserved for wealthy men. Julio wasn't loved. He was calculated. You got too close? You lost. You asked too many questions. You vanished. He didn't need bodyguards. He was the reason bodyguards existed. And yet, he had spoken to her. Not once, not by accident. 3 times. And the entire staff had noticed. In the employee locker room, the conversations weren't loud, just sharp. Did you see him look at her? He stood up. For her, that girl's playing with live wires. They weren't jealous. They were cautious. Because Cesar didn't just act on impulse. Every move he made had meaning. Every silence, a message. And Naira had just become part of his vocabulary. The hostess had only spoken to Julio Cesar once. It was her 3rd week at Bella Vita, and a pair of foreign investors had insisted on sitting at his usual booth, the one near the cellar hallway. She hesitated, looked toward the floor manager, got a nod she didn't believe. So she seated them. They hadn't even finished their appetizers when a man in a black coat arrived, said nothing, and stood silently by the booth. 5 minutes later, both investors stood, one of them mumbling something about respecting local customs. They left their untouched entrees behind. Julio walked in 10 minutes later, sat at his booth like nothing had ever happened. The next day, the hostess found a bottle of rare red wine in her locker. No card. The floor manager didn't speak to her again for 3 days. No one made that seating mistake again. Cesar didn't enforce respect. He created atmospheres where disrespect couldn't survive. And he didn't do it with shouting or threats. He did it by being the one person whose silence made people think twice about everything they said. He never protected the weak. That was the rule. Because weakness to Julio wasn't just lack of strength. It was lack of awareness. Weakness was noise, panic, desperation, and Naira? She had none of those. She hadn't begged for help. She hadn't flinched when Declan grabbed her. She hadn't made a scene. She had stood, watched, endured, and that made her interesting. Not in a romantic way, not in a way that needed saving, but in a way that made a man like Cesar take pause. She had passed a test she didn't know she was taking. And now, she was no longer just a face in the restaurant. She was a mark on the board. In his corner booth, Julio Cesar sat with a glass of water and nothing else. No meal, no wine, just stillness. He watched the room without watching it. His eyes tracked movement like he was memorizing a rhythm, not observing behavior. Every now and then, a server would pass, and his gaze would follow, not out of interest, but precision. Then Naira stepped into view. She didn't see him right away. She was taking an order 2 tables over, writing on her pad with the same calm she always carried. Nothing about her had changed, not her uniform, not her posture, not her pace. But the room changed around her. A man at a table lowered his voice when she walked past. A woman from the finance district, known for her cruel tips, placed her napkin more neatly when Naira approached. People noticed now, and they didn't know why, but Julio did. He'd replayed that moment in his head a dozen times since that night. The moment Declan touched her. The moment she didn't yell, didn't shrink. The moment she looked at him and said, "Please don't touch me." No fear, no tremble, just facts. It wasn't resistance, it was control. He admired that, because power didn't respect chaos. It respected discipline. And what Naira had shown him wasn't a cry for help. It was proof she didn't need it. He picked up his glass, took 1 sip, and set it down without a sound. His bodyguard leaned in slightly from behind. "You want her moved?" he asked, voice low. Julio shook his head once. "She's already moving." He tapped a finger on the table twice. Nothing urgent, just thought, then said quietly, almost to himself. She didn't flinch. That's not weakness. That's control. That night, the weather turned. Rain came down in sheets, hammering the sidewalks like the city was trying to wash itself clean. Bella Vita stayed open. Inside, everything remained composed. Wine glasses still gleamed, silver still shined, and servers still glided across the floor like nothing outside existed. Naira stood near the back hallway, double-checking a receipt slip. She could feel it again. The shift. Not tension. Not fear. Awareness. Eyes followed her now. Not all at once. Not always directly. But she felt it in the pause between footsteps, in the slight hush when she passed a table. She delivered a bottle of Merlot to table 4, regulars, quiet men who never tipped below 20%. One of them smiled at her and said, "You're Cesar's girl now." She didn't answer, because it wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. She walked back toward the kitchen, mind quiet, heartbeat steady. Behind her, conversations resumed, but not about her. No one dared be overheard saying her name. In the locker room, she found another envelope tucked behind her coat. Inside, a list of 3 names. No instructions, no context, just 3 names. She folded the paper and slid it into her apron pocket. Not because she planned to use it, but because she knew it wasn't a request, it was a reminder. The rain kept falling, and in that rain across town someone else, someone who once laughed at her for refilling his drink too slowly, was about to find out what it meant when Julio Cesar watched someone. But that story wasn't hers to tell. Hers was still unfolding. As she stepped out after her shift, the same black car from before idled by the curb. The window rolled down halfway. No one inside spoke. A white card slid halfway through the gap with one word written on it, "Ready?" The knock came at 10:14 p.m., right before closing. 2 sharp taps on the staff hallway wall near the wine cellar, not a door. Naira turned from polishing glasses and looked up. The hallway was empty, but everyone else had gone still. The chef froze over the open burner. The busboy stopped stacking plates. Even the floor manager stepped out of the way without saying a word. She didn't ask who knocked. She already knew. Naira untied her apron, wiped her hands, and walked into the hallway. At the end of it, behind the curtain that separated wine inventory from real power, a heavy wooden door stood ajar. It was never open, not unless someone had already been let in. She stepped through. The private room was colder than the rest of the restaurant. Concrete floor, dark wood walls, no music. Just one table, one chair, and one man seated like the space had been built for him. Julio Cesar. He didn't look up when she entered. "Close the door," he said. She did, then waited. He slid a manila envelope across the table. "Do not open it. Do not delay. Deliver it to the front desk of the building written on the back." She didn't step forward. "And if I don't?" His eyes finally met hers. "You will." She stepped forward, picked up the envelope, and turned it over. A building name and address were scrawled in small, clean handwriting. Winchester Building. Suite 18C. Naira nodded once. "I'll go now." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You didn't ask why. I figured you'd tell me if I needed to know." A flicker of something. Approval? Amusement? Moved behind his eyes. He said nothing more. She left. Naira didn't take the train. She didn't call a rideshare either. She walked, 3 blocks south, then 2 east, where a yellow cab idled near the pharmacy on 14th. She climbed in, gave the driver the building name and nothing else. He didn't ask questions. At the Winchester Building, a uniformed desk clerk looked up from a security monitor as she entered the marble lobby. "Delivery?" he asked, already reaching for a clipboard. Naira nodded and handed over the sealed envelope without looking at it again. He checked the label, signed something with quick strokes, and slipped it into a drawer under the desk. That was it. She turned to leave. But just before the glass doors opened, the clerk called out quietly, "Ma'am?" She paused. "Don't come back here after dark, no matter who sends you." She didn't respond. Didn't need to. Back outside, the night felt colder, not in temperature, but in tone. The kind of cold that didn't touch your skin, just moved along beside you like it had its own reasons for being there. Naira walked the long route home, No shortcuts, no alleyways. She kept one hand in her coat pocket, brushing her fingers across her keys with each step. By the time she reached her apartment, it was nearly midnight. The hallway light flickered once when she climbed the stairs. Her front door was untouched, but something was different. Folded neatly and taped to the center of the door was a piece of white paper. "The men who visited won't return." She peeled the paper off and stepped inside, locked every bolt, pulled the curtains tight. Then she sat down on her bed, still in her coat. She didn't feel safe. She felt noticed, and in this world that meant something deeper than safety. It meant she had stepped into a different category, not just seen but used, not just used, trusted. And trust, in this world, it always had a cost. The envelope from earlier, the one she hadn't opened, still sat tucked behind the second drawer in her dresser. She had almost forgotten about it. Almost. But tonight something felt heavier. Not the paper. The silence. She pulled the drawer open and reached for it. The seal was still clean, untouched. This one hadn't come with instructions. No label. No address. No weight on her shoulders when it was handed to her. It had simply appeared, and that made it more dangerous. She unfolded the flap and pulled out the contents. One photograph. One sheet of printed paper. She looked at the photo first. Her breath hitched. It was him. Face slightly aged. Eyes tired, but unmistakable. Tariq, her brother's best friend. The one who used to walk her home from middle school. The one who disappeared the same month her brother got arrested. She stared at the image like it might move. He was standing in front of a used car dealership, holding a set of keys and laughing with someone just outside the frame. Date stamped. 2 weeks ago. She hadn't heard his name in years. Not since the trial. Not since the silence. Not since her brother's case was dropped without cause and swept into a file no one wanted to reopen. She reached for the second page. Typed words. 2 paragraphs. Legal language. Her eyes scanned quickly. A sworn affidavit. Witness to false charges. Signed under seal. The bottom corner carried the faint imprint of a law firm. Cesar hadn't told her to look at this. Hadn't told her to keep it, which meant he wanted her to decide what it meant. She sat back, knees pulled to her chest, the papers resting lightly in her lap. This wasn't a task. It was a gift. Or a test. Maybe both. Because the man in that photo wasn't just a face from her past. He was part of a cover-up. And now she held the first real thread. Naira didn't sleep. She sat with the photo and the affidavit until sunrise, the documents resting on her lap like they could warm her, but all they did was remind her how cold silence could be when it came from the people who were supposed to protect you. Her brother's case had never made the news. Just an arrest, a fabricated confession, and a buried file. Back then, she'd been 17. No money, no leverage, no lawyer willing to touch the mess. They said it was a case of mistaken identity, but the charges stayed. And then Tariq vanished. Now here he was, alive, laughing, and apparently ready to talk, unless this was something else. She took the affidavit and folded it into a small envelope, one without a label. Then she placed the photo inside a book and slid it onto her shelf, second row, far left, behind the old cookbooks she never used. Her phone buzzed once. No name. Good work. She left her apartment around noon, coat pulled tight, eyes calm. She didn't head to Bella Vita. She didn't check in with the floor manager. Instead, she walked into a small, unmarked office building near State and Archer. Inside, the receptionist looked up. Before she could speak, a man stepped out from the hallway behind her. Tall, dark suit, clean voice. "Miss Ellis?" Naira nodded. He handed her another envelope. Thicker. He didn't explain, just walked away. She stepped back outside, turned the corner, and leaned against a lamppost before opening it. Inside, another name, another face, another piece of something larger than what she'd ever planned to be part of. She tucked it away. This time she didn't hesitate. She knew what to do. That night, tucked under her door was a new note. No envelope, no flair. Just one line, handwritten in the same block letters as before. This was never about protection. It's about what you can carry. They took her brother in the middle of dinner. It was a Wednesday. She remembered because the pot on the stove had barely started to boil, and their mother had called from the bedroom asking if anyone fed the dog. Their little apartment had always been noisy. Dishes clinking, buzzing low, old floorboards protesting every step. But when the knock came, followed by the words "open the door," all of it stopped. Her brother Malik was 17, tall, soft-spoken, quick to laugh when she was quiet too long. He'd gone to the store an hour before to grab milk, came back with a scratch on his neck and a look she hadn't seen before. He didn't explain it. And now, there were 5 men outside the door. Only 2 wore badges. Malik didn't run. He didn't argue. He looked at her once before they cuffed him, eyes wide, not with fear, with confusion, like he couldn't figure out what he'd missed. He was gone in less than 4 minutes. Their mother screamed so loud the neighbor called her name through the wall. And, Naira? She stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands still on the stove dial. The water boiled over, but she didn't move. That was the first time she'd learned that silence didn't mean powerlessness. Sometimes, silence was where you stored every scream until someone with power had to listen. No one did. They said Malik fit the description. That was the explanation. Wrong place, wrong hoodie, wrong skin tone on the wrong block when somebody needed to close a case. Naira was still in high school. Her mother juggled 2 jobs. There was no lawyer, just a tired public defender who called Malik Marcus for the first 3 hearings. The evidence? A shoe print, a partial witness statement, security footage that conveniently glitched during the moment in question. The arrest stuck. The story didn't. They never convicted him. They didn't need to. They held him long enough for school to expel him, long enough for every employer to Google his name and turn the other way, long enough to make sure the label stayed tattooed on his file even after the charges were dropped. Her mother broke down quietly. No sobs, just slipped deeper into herself, folding laundry like it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Naira tried everything. Letters to local officials, emails to reporters, even walked into a station once with a folder full of printouts she didn't fully understand. A sergeant there laughed. "You know how many kids say they're innocent? You got nothing." She walked out that day with the folder still in her hands, and something harder in her chest. It was the day she realized truth wasn't enough. It had to come with weight, and power was the only language these people listened to. So she stopped trying to shout. She started listening. She started watching. And slowly she learned. People tell the truth when they think you're not important enough to hear it. Naira became quiet on purpose. She kept her head down in class, took notes like her life depended on them. And maybe it did. She noticed patterns. Who skipped lunch to avoid being seen? Which teachers called on certain students less? How every system made silence look like safety, until it wasn't. After graduation, she didn't stay close to the neighborhood, but she didn't run either. She took night shifts at places nobody noticed, waitressed in corners where voices lowered when money hit the table, cleaned offices that locked drawers but not conversations, learned how to watch without reacting, how to nod without agreeing, how to file moments away. And in every room she paid attention to what fear sounded like when it thought it wasn't being watched. Julio Cesar was the first man who looked at her like he recognized it. When he whispered that one word, leave, she'd understood immediately, not just the meaning, the choice behind it. He didn't save her because she was vulnerable. He stepped in because she didn't flinch, because she stood still, because she was already speaking his language. Caesar wasn't her savior. He was something else. He was her amplifier, a mirror held up to her silence. Only this time, when the silence landed, the world shook, and now that world was watching her, waiting for her next move. The folder from Caesar still sat in the back of her closet. She hadn't touched it since the last delivery, but tonight, something pushed her. She reached for it and brought it to her table. The pages were crisp, sealed in a simple plastic sleeve. No label on the cover, no instructions. She opened it. The top page was a police report, redacted. Entire blocks of text blacked out. names removed, times adjusted. But the first 3 lines were enough. Arrest date, victim name, suspect description. It was Malik's file. She flipped through the next few pages, more blackout lines, more pieces of something meant to confuse. But then, at the bottom corner of the last page, she saw it, stamped faintly in blue, barely legible. J.C. Julio Cesar, like a signature only meant for those who knew how to see it. Naira leaned back in her chair. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't kindness. Cesar had seen her file, and he'd chosen to show her that he saw it, which meant he knew what it meant to her. It wasn't power she wanted, and now someone had handed her the one piece no one else dared lift. She stared at the initials for a long time, then slowly closed the file. At midnight, a new envelope slid under her door. No stamp, no name, just one sentence written inside. Next time, we open it together. The request came without warning, slipped under the register at Bella Vita during her shift. A folded slip of paper. No name, just a location, a time, and a line that read, "Wear black. Speak nothing." She recognized the address immediately. Karna Hall. Private club. Rivals of Caesar's table. No reservations, no public listings, no second chances. She didn't ask questions. That night, Naira stood at the edge of Karna's double doors, dressed in clean lines and silence. Her coat was long, her hair pulled back. No jewelry, no smile. A doorman opened the entrance before she knocked. Inside, the air was different. Thinner, scented with luxury and power trying too hard. Men in navy suits leaned over low conversations. She was led to a table in the center. The message was clear. She was meant to be seen. She didn't speak. She didn't order. She sat and waited. A man she didn't know entered 10 minutes later and stopped when he saw her. He adjusted his jacket once, then took a seat at the next table, not across from her, beside her. She felt his gaze without turning, and still, she said nothing, because this wasn't a conversation. It was a presence, and her presence in this room, at this table, under this light, wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the man who'd sent her, and everyone in that club understood that immediately. The man at the next table didn't eat. He didn't greet anyone. He just sat, elbow on the armrest, thumb grazing his jaw, eyes flicking to Naira every few minutes like he couldn't believe she was still sitting there. She never once looked back. Servers moved carefully around her, giving her distance like she was already claimed. Someone tried to light a cigar nearby. A hostess quietly whispered, "Not tonight," and guided him toward the terrace. Everything shifted in small, deliberate steps. The room changed its posture because she hadn't changed hers, and that was the power of silence in the right room. After 20 minutes, the man beside her leaned slightly toward her, not enough to draw attention, but enough for the words to land softly. "You do realize showing your face here was a move." Naira didn't turn. "I didn't show it. I was sent." He chuckled once. "Low. You think that makes it safer?" "No. I think it makes it clear." His voice dropped. "You're marked now." She reached for her glass of water, sipped once, then replied, "Then mark it carefully." She stood, no dramatics, no message, just a simple act of leaving when she'd done what she was asked to do. She walked out of Karna Hall without being followed, without a word from the staff. But she knew. The silence didn't mean they hadn't noticed. It meant they understood what was now in motion. And what wasn't theirs to interrupt. The streets were mostly empty by the time Naira reached her block. A bus hissed 2 lanes away, pulling into a stop with no one waiting. A late-night vendor closed his cart without music. Chicago's noise had tucked itself in early tonight. She walked with even steps. Her mind didn't race. Her breathing didn't change. But she knew something had shifted the moment she reached her apartment building. The door handle wasn't dusty. That meant someone had touched it recently. She unlocked it anyway. Nothing broken, nothing forced. But when she stepped inside, the difference was immediate. The faint scent of citrus. The floors had been mopped. The light bulb near the kitchen, The one that had flickered for a week no longer buzzed. Her couch cushion was no longer crooked. On the counter her scattered mail had been stacked and sorted, the kind of order that wasn't offered, only delivered. She didn't call anyone. She didn't check for cameras or notes. She simply took her shoes off, walked to the bathroom, and found fresh towels folded where there had been none that morning. In the kitchen, the dishes she hadn't gotten to, clean. The stove, wiped. And in the middle of the table a small glass vase she didn't own now held 5 white calla lilies. Fresh, crisp, quiet. Naira stared at them for a long time. Then she sat down, elbows on the table, hands clasped loosely, like a woman who understood. She was being moved, piece by piece, into something larger than herself, and that she was allowing it, not because she was weak, but because she had chosen the weight. She opened the fridge to grab water. There it was, center shelf, a folded note, no envelope, resting between a glass bottle and a container of leftover rice she hadn't touched in days. Naira stared at it for a beat, then reached in and unfolded the paper. Block letters, same hand, same weight in its simplicity. You're doing fine. Just 4 words that carried more force than a room full of commands. She stood there with the fridge open, cool air brushing her face, while the silence in the apartment settled. Her phone buzzed once from the coffee table. Unknown number. She closed the fridge, turned off the light, and stood in the center of her apartment, the lilies still catching moonlight on the table behind her. Everything had changed, but not because someone had cleaned her home or delivered flowers. It changed because silence had turned into something else, recognition. And the one thing power respected more than noise was consistency. She hadn't flinched. Not in Bella Vita, not in Carna Hall, not here. So now? She had been acknowledged by enemies, by watchers, by the man who'd said nothing but moved everything. As she walked toward her room, something crinkled under her foot. A second note, smaller, folded once, slid just beneath the rug. She picked it up. 1 word. Tomorrow. Bella Vita smelled different when it was empty. No perfume in the air, no spices, no soft clash of silver, just polished floors and quiet light settling over mahogany chairs that had never held anyone like her. Not tonight. Tonight she didn't wear an apron. She wore black, not the uniform kind, but the kind that turned heads and shut mouths. A dress, sleek, clean lines, nothing flashy, but it moved like it belonged in this room. Naira walked in without being announced. The maitre d' nodded once, then stepped aside without a word. He knew. Everyone knew. The tables were already set. But tonight she wasn't walking between them with a tray. She was walking among them as someone else. Someone they'd all whispered about. The girl who stood up without raising her voice. The one Cesar didn't ignore. Guests turned slowly as she passed. Some stood straighter. Some smiled. Not warm smiles, but the kind that said you're unexpected, and we don't know how to prepare for you. Her presence was already doing the work. Julio Cesar was already seated. Same booth. Same posture. Same coat draped over the back of his chair like it had never been touched by another hand. But tonight, he didn't look like a shadow at the edge of the room. He looked like the center. The people around him weren't eating. They were waiting. Naira approached, not rushed, not hesitant, like someone who had been invited but didn't need the invitation to prove her place. When she stopped beside the booth, he looked up once. Just space, opened by acknowledgement. She slid into the seat across from him. He didn't speak right away, didn't offer small talk, didn't ask how her day had been. He simply looked at her. Not like he was studying her anymore, but like he was confirming something he'd already decided. You understand what tonight is? He asked. She nodded. Visibility. He tilted his head slightly. What do you see in the room? Naira didn't look around. She didn't need to. I see people waiting to see if I flinch. If I forget I wasn't always here, if I'll crack under. He studied her face. And she met his eyes. They'll get bored. Eventually, that was when he smiled. You're not wrong, he said. The room hadn't been this quiet all night. Attention. Dozens of guests, most of them regulars who spoke in numbers and back-channel deals, sat with full glasses but empty words. Conversations dropped when Naira sat across from Cesar. Not out of curiosity, out of instruction. Julio hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His posture gave the command, watch. But don't interrupt. Naira noticed it, the way power moved around him without effort. How silence thickened when he blinked, and how eyes darted away the second hers didn't. He leaned slightly forward. You read the file, he said. I did. You understand what it means? It means you see further back than most. He gave the faintest nod. And you're still here. I haven't run from anything since I was 17. That pulled the edge of his mouth up. You know what happens when someone like me starts investing in someone like you? He asked, voice low. They question if you've gone soft. They question if I've made a bet. Naira glanced across the room, at the tables now shifting into conversation again, at the heads that turned too slowly, too late. They're not betting against you, she said. They're betting against me. He lifted his glass of water. They'll follow you, you know, he said, pausing just before the sip. Not me. As the glass touched his lips, a man from the far table stood and walked toward Thema Nira. Not Caesar. His hands were empty, but his message wasn't. Eyes. And he didn't slow down. The man never made it to the table. Cesar's bodyguard moved before the second footstep landed. No shove. No raised hand. Just a step forward, a look, and a pause heavy enough to drop the air pressure in the room. The man stopped mid-stride. Eyes flicked to Cesar. Then to Naira. Then he turned, murmured something to no one, and walked back to his seat like nothing had happened. But everything had. Naira didn't move. She didn't even blink. Julio placed his glass back down and looked at her like the interruption was just another test she didn't know she was passing. Then he said, You've been watched long enough. It's time you know why. She leaned forward slightly. I've never needed to be rescued. You weren't. Then what was all this? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and placed something on the table. A key. Small. Silver. Unmarked. She looked at it, then at him. What is that? A door, he said. And a seat. Same. Location. She tilted her head. He continued. I don't hire assistants. I don't need decoration. I choose people who've already proven they understand power without using noise. Naira stared at the key again. What's the position? He smiled, the first full one she'd seen. Something between shadow and partner. Naira kept her eyes on the key. Its weight wasn't in the metal. It was in the history behind the offer. Behind the silence. Behind every moment that brought her to this table, in this dress, with this man who never gave gifts without meaning. You think I've earned this? She asked. I think you didn't fold when you could have. I think you didn't need a title to know who you were. And if I say no? Julio's voice didn't change. Then I respect your choice. But the table stays open. That answer mattered. She leaned back slightly, folding her hands, then said the one thing she hadn't said since that first night. What word did you whisper? Julio paused, only for a breath. Warning. He let it hang in the space between them. To Declan? She asked. He nodded. To him, then his voice dropped lower. But to you, it was a beginning. She held his gaze. No flinch, no smile, just recognition. They both understood what that night had become, not just a turning point, but a signal. Power didn't need to announce itself. It simply arrived. And now, it sat between them, waiting. Her phone buzzed on the table. No name, just a number she didn't recognize. Naira looked at the screen, then up at Julio. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't answer. She said, Let's begin